Hello and welcome to episode number 21 of Diary of a Security Consultant, the show where we talk all things security consultancy. A little bit different this week. This show is going to be a recording of a webinar that we're doing today, which is entitled Conflict Management Concepts for Security Professionals. So it's a 2-hour webinar, so quite long. It's going to go on the podcast and the YouTube channel. As you will know if you're watching it on the podcast or YouTube channel, I suppose. It's going to be about the basic concepts of conflict management that security professionals need to understand. In my experience of conflict management with security professionals is we focus in on one niche part of conflict management, which is high-end aggressive customers. When in reality, the vast majority of conflicts don't start off that way. They escalate to that from something else. And that's going to be the common theme, understanding some of the basic concepts and then some of the interesting, I suppose, strategies and tips that I've used over the years to help me manage conflict. So hopefully you guys get something out of it. I'll come back on at the end when everybody's gone and we can probably do a quick wrap up. But for now, I'll leave you with the webinar. Thanks very much, guys. Currently 35 and still people joining. So that's brilliant. You know, when I put it up, I thought, Jesus, like the last couple, we might have got 50 and maybe get 20 will show up. But to get 142, I was amazed. I thought somebody was hacking my website or something. But thanks very much, everyone, for taking the time. You know, it's 2 hours on a Monday evening. It's not easy to give up. And most of you are giving up your own time. Like, it's not as if you know, on a training course, work is paying you. So I do appreciate it. So I'm just going to stick you all on mute at the start. But anyone that wants to come in and ask questions, just fire away as you want. You can either do it in the chat, I'm going to keep an eye there, or you can do it in the, just unmute yourself and ask the question if you want to do that. So I suppose why I decided to do this subject, the last one that we did was on reasonable force, and some of you were there on that one, and I got some pretty good feedback. And I'd meant to do one kind of every month or so, and then it all kind of kicked off. And people have been asking me, and there's some people on this that asked me to do a couple more. So I was looking around, and then somebody's probably seen last week, we with Mike and ICSE there, we won an award for the National Training Award for a Conflict Management Program. And then I thought about, well, maybe it's something for the security industry, because what I often find with the security industry is that even though we tend to be really, really good at managing front-end conflict, face-to-face conflict with people, one, everybody does it in a different way and does it in their own way and stuff like that. But we tend to concentrate on that little niche of conflict, which is the high-end aggressive conflict that we find ourselves in, which is probably only less than 5% of the actual difficult situations we find ourselves in. And there's not a whole lot of emphasis put on the other types of conflicts, you know, that we deal with. And oftentimes it's, in my experience of working with courts and insurers and stuff like that, it's often the case in my experience that poorly managed low-end conflict and intrapersonal conflict is often what results in us having to deal with the high-end conflict situations. So I thought maybe a little bit about the concepts of how personality works and how the psychology of conflict a little bit. Like I said, I've done a fair bit of study on that sort of stuff over the years in terms of academic study, and then obviously practical application from the doors and retail and stuff like that. And that's why I found how do you deal with Debenhams protesters. Come on, Pat. So you'd be nice to them, Pat. That's how you deal with them. So in terms of what we're going to talk about, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds with stuff because I know people have their own ways of dealing. I'm going to talk a bit about tips and strategies and stuff that I found that used. If there was academics on it, they'd probably murder me for some of the things that I say, but I've done a lot of academic research on it. I found that, you know, a lot of the times with the academic stuff, it's written by people who've never actually been in an argument. You know, it's fantastic doing an academic study in a very, very controlled environment where we have control over the environment, the circumstance, and the time. It's a bit more challenging when we're operating in what we call bounded rationality. So we'll talk a little bit today about that concept of bounded rationality and how it affects human beings. And I suppose about some of the concepts around how we're affected by conflict, which I think is very much overlooked in the security industry. You know, that we're just expected to get on with things when we're involved in a conflict instance. But the reality is that conflict has an impact on every single one of us. Every time you're in an argument or a row, it has an impact on you. And your brain, your limbic system learns from that, and it distributes that again in the next conflict that you're involved in, you know? So we're all picking up habits, good and bad, in conflict all the time. And I often think that we often hammer ourselves for the bad. when in reality, probably most of us on this training course have a 99.5% success rate with conflict. But I'm sure we all remember the times where we didn't manage it particularly well, you know, and they're the ones that sit in the back of our head and they give us what I refer to as conflict scars, you know, that sit with us the next time we have to deal with a similar situation or a similar personality or a similar stereotype. And we do a lot of stuff in conflict that, if we were to say it out loud, would probably be very much frowned upon, I suppose, in modern society. We stereotype people, we label people, we dehumanize people. We risk assess people based on how they dress, how they look, what background they come from. And they, in modern society, are often seen as negative things. But on the flip side of that, they've kept us alive and our ancestors alive and our forefathers alive for generations and generations and generations. The fact that we are here today tells us that risk assessment and stereotyping in conflict works. You know, kept your grandparents alive, kept our great grandparents alive, going right back to caveman stuff, you know. Now we've had to moderate it. And I think we've got a couple of ladies, definitely one or two ladies on here, but I think we're predominantly men. And we'll talk a little bit, maybe if we get time later on, about the gender difference in conflict. There's a huge gender difference in conflict. A lot of the research now is pointing to the fact that women are genetically better set up for modern day social conflict than men are. Women are genetically better set up because of the adrenal path and how cortisol is released through the system for dealing with low level, high consistency arguments that society now demands that we deal with. Whereas men are still predominantly hardwired for adrenal response, fight or flight in conflict. We are much better equipped for high level, short outbursts of conflict. And that's still what we're predominantly designed for. Fight or flight. But HR tends to frown upon both of those now. You know, how did you deal with that angry person? Killed him, but he's no longer angry, you know, or ran away from us. So the security industry forces us into interaction that we're probably not genetically set up for, as well as probably generations into the future will be. You know, a lot of you guys would have come from door backgrounds. You know, I still remember standing on a door the first time somebody threatened me with Facebook. You know, put this guy out and he turns and he swings and he does the posturing, chest out, chin out, baring the teeth. And you're thinking, here we go, I'm going to break your legs, I'm going to break your arms, I'm going to stab you. And he turns around and he says, I'm going to put you all over Facebook. I remember looking at him kind of going, I don't really know how to take that. You know, how do you manage something like that? Like, you know, I'm going to put you over Facebook. At the time, I didn't care. Didn't even have a Facebook. You know, but now that's a big issue for people. You know, it's a huge issue for young people entering the industry, you know, to have themselves put out there and things like that on social media. So I'm going to share some slides. I know it's not going to come across in the podcast, but I'm going to talk through them quite a bit, I suppose. At the end, sorry, I meant to share, at the end, I'm keeping a list of who's signing in and how they're signing in and stuff like that. Everybody's going to get a cert for this. I'm going to send on everybody, that's the cert that everyone gets, as always, when I do these things. So I'm going to send out them on by email. You'll get a copy of the slides and you'll get the recording of the show itself. So if anyone wants to use it for CPD or anything like that, you can feel free to use it first. If I mention stuff as I'm going, other resources or other research that you're interested in, just drop me an email or a message in the chat and I'll make sure I get it onto you as I'm going through it. But I want to talk a little, I suppose, about what we're going to talk about tonight. So for the next kind of hour and a bit, and I want to leave about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A and stuff like that. I'm going to talk about different types of conflicts because we often associate just one, and that's interpersonal conflict, but there are many other types of conflict. How your personality affects conflict and the different types of personality you come across. A little bit about the psychology of conflict, some strategies, and then a little bit on stress and resilience and stuff like that. So I suppose to start off with a little bit on, and like I said, feel free to drop any comments or disagreements, whatever you might have, into the chat as we're going. Many people, when we talk about conflict associated with this one here, interpersonal conflict, two people having an argument. And that's probably the most common manifestation of conflict that we come across. It's me and another party through miscommunication, a miscommunication that affects where it seems that somebody else's values or beliefs are threatened. We end up in a conflict situation. My experience of this is that oftentimes this is not a root cause. It's often a manifestation. It's often how conflict shows up in our workplace, but it's often not the cause of the conflict, the root cause of the conflict. In my experience, root cause conflict often sits either here in intrapersonal conflict, that's intrapersonal conflict, and here in intergroup conflict. So Interpersonal conflict is the conflict that sits within a person's head, how we deal with stress and conflict in our heads. And in my experience, that's often the most common root cause of conflict in the security industry. People operating under stress, making poor decisions, and manifesting their conflicts on other people. So people who mishandle conflict in here, and I'm sure we all have that, I suppose, friend or friends in there like that. You can have an argument with them today, and 15 minutes later, it's forgotten about. They get over it very, very quickly. And I'm sure we all know people that you can have a falling out with it now, and they hold on to it, and they get bitter and twisted, and they let it eat it up, and they take it out on you for weeks or even months following that, And it's just poorly managed conflict in here. In my experience of workplaces in the security industry, that is probably the most common cause of employment issues, of people getting in trouble with their bosses, other managers, is what I call secondary conflict, which is where they're in a high stress or a high adrenaline conflict. The other person burns off all of their adrenaline by shouting, roaring, and venting across the board. And they leave. And you had that professional consequence. You stood there and you controlled your emotion and you controlled your adrenaline. And that person burned all theirs off, and then they storm off. And you're left there full of adrenaline. And immediately afterwards, or very soon afterwards, the next conflict situation arises. And we lash out at a person who possibly doesn't deserve it. And it had nothing to do with anything that person did wrong. We just found an easy target. We talk about in psychology the availability bias. The brain will deload its stress, but it's very selective about how it deloads its stress. It will deload its stress on what it perceives to be the nearest available easy target. And when we're at work, the big angry person is often a challenging target to deload stress on. There's a consequence to deloading. Your colleague, when you snap at them a couple of minutes later, or a customer who you snap at a couple of minutes later, is often a much easier target. Or when you go home and have an argument with your wife or your husband or your kids, because they're a much easier target. There's no consequence to doing that. And we'll talk a lot about consequence later on. I think it's a huge thing. But I think interpersonal conflict, residual anger, Stephen put it very well there, built up in people's heads and lashed out at the nearest available target, often manifests itself in third-party conflict. Another one that I think is very much overlooked is the one on the far side of my screen over here, which is intergroup conflict, which is conflict that emerges among tight-knit groups and ends up being manifest on the third party. So in a very male-dominated security industry, where we would still have, I suppose, 90-odd% male-dominated industry, far too much testosterone and ego floating around in small, tight-knit groups where people are still trying to prove alpha male status. And that intergroup tension, intergroup conflict that can emerge of trying to one-up each other, and the war stories and all the stuff that goes along that, can often end up with people taking out an interpersonal conflict on a third party that probably didn't deserve it. Showing off in front of other people. Clash of personalities within a group when it's taken out on somebody else. I don't know if you guys agree. If you disagree, feel free to say, but I think that's very commonly, somebody feeling, particularly newer people, we talk about Dunning-Kruger and different blog articles there, but new people trying to prove themselves within an industry to their group of peers, or feeling like they have to prove themselves and going above and beyond what will be expected of them and taking that out on other people then, very, very challenging to manage as a manager or something like that. How do you manage that tension within the group of alpha males? And then you have interorganizational clashes of personality. Anybody who works as a service provider will know that, where you have a security officer. Retail security is a very good example. A contracted retail security officer, contracted to an employer who pays his or her salary, but dealing with the employer's client who has a conflicting set of priorities to the employer, and having demands made on by both that often conflict, and that often results then in manifest issues with interpersonal conflict, third party customers and stuff like that, where there's mixed messages and poor communication coming through. So I think all of these three, interpersonal, intergroup, interorganizational, are much more commonly a root cause of conflict than this interpersonal one. But the interpersonal one is the one we all know. It's the one that gets marched out there, because that's the one where it's shown. That tends to be the easy target for people. And probably, I don't know, would you agree with this, but in my experience, the vast majority of people who we will deal with in a conflict situation are not bad people. They're good people having a bad day. Their family probably wouldn't consider themselves bad people. Their friends wouldn't consider themselves bad people. They would probably consider you a bad person. Anybody who's looked into criminology has probably come across this tenet before. They talk about one of the central tenets of criminology being, that there's about 10% of society at the top whose morals, ethics, and values would never allow them to break the law or treat other people badly. There's about 10% at the bottom whose morals, ethics, and values demands that they break the law or treat other people badly. And we're never going to change that. They're not the people for whom we're seeking behavioral change. They're the people for the only thing that works is deterrence. Hard access and deterrence. And then in the middle sits 80% of society who would like to think themselves good, upstanding citizens. But if the benefit or the reward for breaking the law or treating other people badly outweighs the risk or the consequence of doing so, they'll take a chance on it. And most people will probably say, no, that's not me. I'm definitely in that top 10%. Morals and ethics would never allow me to break the law, treat other people badly. Until you ask people how many people have ever had a late point in a bar or gone above the speed limit. And they go, that doesn't make you criminal, because people can rationalize any behavior as long as there's a benefit to them. They can rationalize any sense of behavior. We've all seen it with criminals. There's lots of people here from retail security backgrounds, how they can rationalize coming in and stealing something as not being a crime until they're caught. When the speeding becomes speeding, when the flashing blue lights appear behind you in the car. Prior to that, you were just in a hurry. But our brain can rationalize any sort of positive behavior as long as there's a benefit to us to doing so. And as long as the benefit is perceived to be outweighed by the risk, people will take a chance. And as long as there's no consequence to an action, the action will continue. And there's that word again, consequence. We're going to talk about that a lot later on. As long as there's no consequence to an action, the action will continue because it becomes a learned success habit. And we'll talk about that in personality now in a second. So I would often say, just because a person chooses to treat you badly doesn't make them a bad person. But we automatically go on that assumption because it's easy for the brain to think black and white. It's easy for the brain to think good or bad. If I'm the good person, then this person automatically must be a bad person. Therefore, I'm entitled to treat them so. And that's a very easy mindset to slip into when we talk about conflict. So I want to talk about, yeah, you're right, Pat. It's very personal. They don't know you well enough to dislike you. The other person doesn't know you well enough to dislike you. In fact, in my case, if they knew me better, they'd probably like me less. But, they don't know me well enough to dislike me. They dislike what I represent. I represent a problem to them, and that's what they dislike. And as long as the problem remains, the dislike will remain, and people would say the most horrible of stuff, I suppose. In terms of personality, I suppose, in conflict, I often talk about how important people's personality is in conflict. And we often talk about the different conflict management styles that they talk about in psychology. So we have the self-appreciating styles on one side, and we have the other appreciating styles on the other side. And in the middle, we have the much more collaborative integrating styles. And we'll talk a little bit about each one, I suppose. On the self-appreciating side, we'll often have the dominant personality type. The dominant personality type is a person who has to win every single argument. And oftentimes with really strong dominant personality types, it's not enough for them to win the argument. In order for them to feel truly happy about having won the argument, they have to make the other person feel bad about having lost the argument. So they can be quite demeaning to people. They're sometimes referred to in psychology as HCPs, high conflict personalities. They will go out of their way, sometimes referred to also in Rory Miller's books, he refers to them as resource predators. They use conflict as a resource, to gain resource. Sometimes referred to as the bullying mindset in other research. And people would say, why would somebody choose to engage in a behavior like that, knowing that it makes another person feel bad? And the reality goes back to what we said there a minute ago, because it works. In my experience, the vast majority of society out there does not deal well with aggressive conflict. When somebody gets in their face, postures, shouts, roars, and screams, and dominates an argument, they back down and give them what they want. So for the dominant personality type, it's a success habit. When I shout, roar, and scream, I get what I want. And like we said earlier on, our brain learns some success habits. So as long as it continues to be successful, we'll continue to do it. The problem for this person arises when they come across an individual who's not willing to be intimidated. They generally don't have a plan B, a logical plan B. And as some of you guys will know who've dealt with high-risk conflict before, it usually results in one or two things. They absolutely melt and all their barriers break down and they go backwards and regressive and sometimes burst into tears. I love when that happens. Or they go into self-sabotage mode. They throw all the toys out of the pram and would sometimes even self-sabotage. You know, the guy who puts his fist through a glass pane or begins to headbutt the door. You know, of absolutely no benefit to him, but it's getting out that rage on somebody who he knows. His mind is selecting the easy target and he's looking at you going, I'm not the easy target. The door's a much easier target, or the window's a much easier target for me to show my dominance. You know, on the same side as that, but further down that equation, we have the competitive type, the competitive conflict management style. These can be difficult to deal with. They can be much more difficult to work with. Hopefully nobody's ever come across this. He's not on here, so we can still talk about him. I'm not going to mention his name now. You all know who we're talking about before this starts, right? So the competitive one is a person who doesn't necessarily care about winning or losing an argument. The benefit to them is in starting an argument, causing an argument. If you're from the door security background, that's the guy who has an idea, he just doesn't want to show it to you. You know, it's the professional protester. It's the person who'll go out of their way to antagonize and ask difficult questions. And why I say it can be difficult to work with is because when you get a competitor within a security team, they're a person who loves just stirring the pot. And they tend to be absolutely fantastic at starting arguments, but they don't tend to stay around for the end. The benefit to them is in causing the argument. So they roll out the hand grenade, kaboom, and walk away smiling. You know, that's the win for them, is the cause of the argument. They'll walk away now happy that they've caused that argument. And that's the benefit to them. Problem is somebody obviously has to be there to finish up the argument, you know, while they're walking off smiling or bent over behind the door, buckled over, laughing at you, having to deal with this. On the opposite side, there's a lot of these have made it through and into the security industry over the years, I suppose, without realizing what it is that they're getting into. It's the avoiding personality type. That's the person who will go out of their way to avoid having to deal with conflict. You know, they let it sit and they avoid it and they don't deal with things and it gets worse and worse and worse. And eventually what happens, it festers and it gets worse. And eventually somebody has to go and deal with that situation. And it's often much, much worse at that point because it's gone to high risk conflict by the time we actually go and deal with it. I always remember one night working in nightclubs, walking down onto a dance floor at this nightclub, and there's a doorman there, and he's from a martial arts background as well. And he, as I walked over, he nudges me. I says, "Everything okay?" He says, "Yeah. See the two guys over here?" I says, "Yeah. They're going to kick off now any minute." And I said, "Right. So why are we standing here?" And he said, "Well, we're waiting for them to kick off." And I said, "Why?" And I said, "So we can stop them." And I said, "So why don't we just walk over and stop him?" Like, you know, but he was avoiding having to deal with till obviously to help him, but he wanted to show off his martial arts skills, which was his strong point. So he avoided going over and deal with it in a way that he was weak, which is communication skills, to wait for it to escalate into something that he was comfortable dealing with, which is violence. You know, the others often also come up as well, the avoiding type, who will, you know, abandon you as soon as the first sign of conflict emerges. That freaky sound of a fire exit door being locked behind you as you're left outside, you know. And then down the bottom, the people that don't tend to last all that much must be very stressful. I sometimes call this the victim mindset, is the obliging type. That's a person who will stand there and let other people shout, roar, and scream at them all the time in the world because it makes the other person feel better. You know, I think it must be a very, very stressful mindset to end up in that mindset where people are just constantly shouting at you and you're not doing anything about it. I think the successful people in the security industry come into the center and they end up even being all the time being one of the compromising styles, either the integrator or the compromiser. You know, a person who knows when to win and knows when to lose, knows when something is worth arguing over and when something's not worth arguing over. And knowing that, look, sometimes it's just battles you're not going to win. There's no point, you know, and the only person who suffers by engaging in that argument is you. And then down the bottom is that rare human being, the collaborator, who is the type of person who's willing to ask for the help of others to solve their problems. Imagine having to ask for help. If I go back to, if you've ever come across, anyone who hasn't come across, I highly recommend his book, Rory Miller, in his book, Facing Violence, is this theory that the human brain will leave an argument in one of three ways. If it wins or perceives it wins, even a slight little perception of a win, if it's given an easy way to lose, or if the benefit of staying outweighs the risk, or is outweighed by the risk. We will only leave in one of those three ways when we're comfortable doing it. And one of the theories he comes across is that the brain doesn't like losing arguments, but one thing it hates more than losing an argument is drawing an argument or having to ask for help with an argument, because that feels like more of a failure. When we lose an argument, we can often rationalize it and come up with an excuse, but when we have to ask for help, it's that perception of weakness, but not just weakness, it's weakness that's on view to everybody else. And we really, really struggle with that sometimes, especially in that alpha male society, like we said. So in terms of conflict, I suppose conflict is never about changing your personality. We all have personalities. Everybody here deals with conflict differently, and everyone in the world deals with conflict. There's no wrong way of dealing with conflict. I suppose it's recognizing what you are, self-awareness, recognizing what you are and what you're good at, and either working on it or risk assessing against it. If you are not good, if you're an obliging type and you're not good with assertive conflict, don't apply for jobs that require you to deal with assertive conflict until you get good at it. And the same thing applies. If you're really good at assertive conflict, working in a nursing home is probably not for you. Because you have to get quite good at obliging conflict and stuff like that. There's no wrong way of dealing with conflict. It's what your personality is suited to. And I suppose as an industry, I think at interview and recruitment stage, we have to get better at risk assessing personalities for roles, because I've seen people who could have been very, very good in the industry over a long period of time, dropped in at the deep end on a role that they clearly hadn't got the personality for right now, and ending up leaving the industry because of that, because they end up with conflict scars. And I don't know if you've ever come across that phrase before, conflict scars, but it's a very, very real thing that I see quite a lot of. Conflict scars is your brain's memory for conflict. So every time we engage in a conflict, we learn something from it. But where we feel we do badly in a particular conflict situation, that leaves a scar. And our brain risk assesses against that scar for future conflict. So it tries to make us avoid similar types of conflict in the future. It's like if you've ever lost control of a car and you go to get behind the wheel again, and your brain gives you all sorts of excuses about why you don't need to get behind this car. Why you not, or you have a bad day at work and you wake up the next morning and your brain comes up with all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't go into work. I'm sick. I hope my arm is sore. It'll give you fake pains. So on this side, you have the emotional brain, the risk assessing brain going, don't go there. Bad things happen in that place. Don't go there. On the other side, you have the logical brain going, rent, mortgage, bills, car payments. And very quickly that overrides it. But the more conflict scars you build up, the harder it is to override it with logic. And eventually people burn out and just go, look, it's just not worth it. The fear is too much. And it's not I'm scared. It's bad things keep happening to me in that place. So my brain is protecting me from going to that place. And it has to be a very challenging mindset to get up and go to work every day with that in the back of your head. That you're dreading going into work because of these things that have happened that you haven't managed intrapersonally in your head. And we all get it. I think there was a statistic released University of Coventry, I believe, this year in the UK about security staff. This is 70% of security staff are suffering from some form of PTSD. And I don't want to glamorize that and say we're suffering in the same way as somebody who's gone to war, etc. is, but PTSD comes on a lot of different levels, and it might be even low level. But for somebody who's only experienced that low level, that still hurts. That still affects people. So, for example, when I go and train, I'm often amazed, and Mike can probably support, he's been on some courses with me really recently. When you go and train with office staff and they ask you questions and you're talking to them about conflict, and I'm coming from a place of high-risk conflict, aggression and violence, and they ask you something and you answer them with a very simple tip, and it's like a light bulb moment. You go, oh my God, that's so simple. What do I do if somebody shouts down the phone at me continuously? Oh, that's easy. You hang up the phone. I go, oh my God, that's so easy. But for them, being shouted down the phone, because that's all they've experienced, being shouted down the phone is terrifying. They've never been in a high-risk conflict situation, somebody arguing, fighting, giving out. The only thing they've ever been exposed to is somebody shouting down the phone, and that's terrifying for them. So conflict in context is very, very, very important. Some people are better equipped for some kinds of conflict than others. My kid goes to after school, and I say this all the time. I always say, give me a big angry person. I can talk to them any day of the week. The two ladies that look after my kid and his friends in after school, 17 kids between the ages of 9 and 11. Yeah, there isn't any amount of money in the world you could pay me to do their job. None. Give me big angry guy any day of the week. I can deal with him. We tend to be more comfortable in dealing with things who we see as similar to ourselves, take us out of our comfort zone, and it's very, very challenging. We end up dealing with conflict at an inappropriate stage, I suppose. At a stage that's not suited to what it did. But all that we know is that the high-risk conflict situations, the dominance, the competing type, they lead to more instances of stress and conflict because you're engaging in more conflict. The avoiding types and the obliging types lead to high incidence because you're being victimized, you're having conflict pushed on you. And we all know that the better we learn to compromise and collaborate, the less conflict and stress we suffer. But it's a very challenging place to get to. I think life experience is the only thing that brings you there, in my experience of it. That stress inoculation that only comes from exposing yourself to conflict situations, and exposing yourself in the right way to conflict situations. When it's managed poorly, it usually leads to managing conflict at the wrong stage of what we call the cycle of conflict. And the cycle of conflict is the 4 stages or phases that every single argument or row will have. This is not something I come up with. It's known for generations and generations. Every argument has a trigger, something that sets it off, either psychologically, incidentally, or situationally. Something sets it off. It has an escalation phase, which is where it grows. And when we're comfortable dealing with conflict, that's where we tend to be good at operating. When we're dealing with a conflict where we are not comfortable, a type of conflict where we're not comfortable, we end up dealing with it in crisis mode, which is the next phase. We end up going to, oh my God, I don't have a logical response for this. I'm going to go into crisis mode. I'm going to go into fight or flight, or secondary limbic responses. We either go with primary limbic responses or amygdalic responses, fight or flight, or secondary ones, freeze, flinch, or fawn. And we'll talk about them if we have some time later on. And then the most often overlooked after the crisis or after the escalation phase is the recovery phase afterwards. How we look after ourselves after a conflict situation. And I think, in my experience, we have all been guilty over the years of trying to tough it out when we probably should have sat down and had a cup of coffee, or taken the rest of the day off, or taken the rest of the night off. We've pushed ourselves through something that's ended up with us being restless or having an argument at home because of something that happened in work, because we didn't look after ourselves. And we all know, we've all worked in the industry for a long, long time, I'm assuming. We've all seen things, marriages ruined, families lost, breakdowns, serious injuries, because people don't manage intrapersonal conflict very well. We try and tough it out, and we don't release it or manage it the way it's meant to be managed. Geez, I'm going to start tears on this now. There's going to be lads, my marriage is broken down. I'm not pointing at you in particular if you're listening to this or watching this, right? It's a big generalization that I'm making there. But it certainly does happen in the industry, I think, and I'm sure we've all seen it over the years with various people. Really, really good people. Yeah, certainly, Sean, it's gone to depression and suicide even with a lot of people that we all know, and not just suicide, but actually on the opposite side of that, potential homicide, where people have gone way over the top on other people that possibly didn't deserve it. But for the grace of God, there could be probably many people, me included, in this course, who could end up doing serious time behind bars for stuff that people probably didn't deserve over the years, because we didn't manage conflict very well internally. Nobody admits anything criminal on one of my courses. You have to do it. Tell me to stop recording before you do it. So we look a bit about neuroscience, and I don't have that long, so I'm not going to go into too much of the, I suppose, the science of neuroscience, I suppose. But I have my brain picture up on the screen, and I know people that's listening to a podcast is not going to get this, but the vast majority of the time we go around dealing with prefrontal cortex, cerebrum, logical brain as we walk around. We deal very well with rationalization. It deals with rationalization, decision making, planning, consequence, language, numbers. You know, that's the bit of the brain that separates us from chimps, dolphins, and people that think Leeds United are going to stay in the Premier League. So it separates us from, people who just aren't rational in general. So most of the time we go around dealing with that. At the very back then we have the cerebellum, the automatic functions of the brain, reptile brain. And then buried deep in the brain, we have the limbic system. And that's the bit we're concerned about, caveman brain, and that deals with emotion and the transfer of risk to the cerebellum. And it's the two little almond-shaped things in there, the amygdala, and that's the bits we're concerned about. When the amygdala gets stimulated. So when the signal comes in, we generally process it through the limbic system, comes in through our senses, through the hippocampus, and we ask ourselves, how does this picture make me feel? How does this situation or incident make me feel that I'm involved in? Based on all the sensory inputs that I'm getting. Am I happy, sad, disgusted, surprised? Based on that, it goes up to the logical brain. How do I know how to respond logically when I feel this way? And then down to the acting brain to be acted on. But when the amygdala gets stimulated, signal comes in through the hippocampus, through the sensory organs, into the limbic system. How does this make you feel? If the answer is fear or risk, bang, amygdala goes off. Buddy, you need to be dealing with this, and you need to be dealing with it fast. And it's often much quicker than system 1 brain. It's often much, much quicker than the logical brain. That's that gut feeling that you get when you know something's wrong, but you don't quite know what. Your logical brain hasn't figured it out yet. And that comes through experiential learning, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But when the amygdala goes off, we get the adrenal release, we get the cortisol release, we get the non-trust coming into the brain, all those toxins, and it starts to take over. And the problem we have with adrenaline and cortisol is that when we were designed with our adrenal system, it was predominantly wired for fight or flight. It was predominantly wired that when we faced a threat, we immediately killed it or ran away. And we used up the adrenaline. Now we don't do that anymore. We're forced to engage in this thing called social argument. And we're full of adrenaline. The person in front of us, as a customer or service user or a client, they have nothing to lose. They're burning off all their adrenaline and all their cortisol. They're using up their energy by shouting and roaring and posturing and dominating. And we're holding it all in. And we're staying calm. And we're staying professional. So adrenaline and cortisol is pushed around the bloodstream. And we start pooling all the oxygenated blood into the core. So we start losing function in the prefrontal cortex. So the longer an argument goes on, the less capable we are of dealing with rational decision making, because the more blood is going to the limbic system, and that's the only part that's functioning in the core of the brain. So our goal should be with conflict, and this is one of the concepts we talk about later on. The goal should be with conflict to change it as quick as we can, either solve it quickly or change it to a planned conflict. Change the time, change the environment to something that we can manage or control. And the issue that we often have, particularly guys who came from a door supervision background, is that we deal quite a lot with reactive conflict. We deal with conflict on the other guy's terms. We are reactive to when they come down. Everything's in their favor. Now there's tools that we've all built up over the years to sort that out and to diffuse that and stuff like that. But in general, we're acting on their terms. Whereas in other stuff, whereas planned conflicts, where we have to get down and have a difficult conversation with somebody, etc., we can have a planned conflict. We can plan the outcome. We can plan the time. We can plan the environment, all those things. And that gives us a sense of control and purpose over things, And some people would ask on the training course, well, how do you control the limbic system? How do you stop the limbic system from kicking in? And the reality is you don't. The limbic system is going to kick in till the day you die. Every single time, regardless. All you can do is control your response to the limbic system. Activating. There's no controlling the limbic system. It's been long before you and long after you. All we do is control how we respond once it gets activated. And there is ways of doing that in high stress environments, how we learn to control ourselves in high stress environments and stuff like that. And we'll talk about some of the concepts. Probably one of the better ones is graduated stress inoculation. By far the best type of training, I know we've got some ex-military guys here, by far the best type of training you can have is graduated stress inoculation to manage limbic system response, by putting people in controlled situations and slowly ramping up the stress. The problem in the security industry is that takes a significant investment in terms of time and resource to build a person up to a stage where they're capable of dealing with a high level of stress and conflict. Significant amount of exposures. As security professionals, as people who want to do well in their career, what we often find ourselves doing is going off and paying for it in our own time. We go off our own back and we go do these training courses, or we go start martial arts and we find some form of stress inoculation, or we go to a gym, work out in the gym, whatever the case might be, But as security providers, I suppose, providing security for other people, going back to that intrapersonal thing as well, I often say, you have absolutely no business looking after the safety of others if you cannot look after yourself, if you're not looking after yourself mentally. You have no business putting yourself in a position where you can look after the safety of others if you can't control your own emotional response. And I think it's something that we have to get out there to people in the industry, that if you look after the safety of others while not looking after your own well-being, ability to manage your own emotions, even physical ability, then you have no place looking after the ability of others, because you're more of a liability than you are an ability, as you go out there, and you're more than likely going to make any particular situation worse. I talked about a couple of weeks ago on a different podcast about this principle of bounded rationality. I don't know if you've come across that principle before. Sherman's, it's actually an economic principle to do with sales and stuff like that. Sales principle said that we act in bounded rationality, not perfect rationality, but we are judged in perfect rationality, so we act in bounded rationality, and bounded rationality is that we are rational, but we are influenced by the environment, by time constraints, often artificial time constraints that we place on ourselves, and by our own cognitive biases, values, and beliefs. So when we're under stress, we never make perfect decisions. But we're going to be judged by somebody sitting in a judge's desk or a manager's office who's never stood in your shoes. And they're going to look at your behavior in perfect rationality, with no fear, no adrenaline, no stress, no experience, and no training. So what I say about bounded rationality is that we are never going to make perfect decisions in conflict. All we can expect to do is make the best bad decision at the time that hopefully moves us towards a solution. If that makes sense. So we're never going to make a perfect decision under stress. So our goal has to be to have enough control over our emotions to make a decent decision that moves us more towards getting back to a position of control, moves us more towards a rational response, and that's what bounded rationality is. It's not about accepting, look, we're going to make poor decisions because we have values, beliefs, and time constraints. It's about saying, look, I know I have these values, beliefs, so I'm going to make this decision to get myself to a position of control till I can make good decisions, and gradually building on our suboptimal decision making until we get back to a decent position of decision making. So the example we would often give is that we're breaking up a third party fight between two people. Chances of arriving into the middle of that and doing one magic technique that solves the problem is pretty slim. So what are we going to do? We're going to arrive in there and we're going to take control of something. We're going to grab an arm, a leg, whatever we can get control of, and we're going to take control of that. And that doesn't solve the problem, but it gets us towards control. And once we get a hold of that, we might move towards some kind of restraint. And when we have a restraint, we might now be able to survey the situation a little bit better and see, well, what's the best route of getting these people out of here? But we can't do that till we get restraint. And then we start moving towards the exits. So we're making decisions. None of those decisions solve the problem, but they're moving us towards a solution to the problem. We're not going to arrive there, do a magic move and end up outside. We're going to make a load of decent decisions that move us towards a solution. Same, it could be a retail security, it could be a close protection situation where there's an ambush situation on your principal or your client. You're not going to make the perfect choice right now. You're going to make the best bad choice available to you while you're being attacked, to move yourself towards a position where you can make better choices. you know, and sometimes it's about accepting that when it comes to conflict, you know, and not putting pressure on yourself to make the perfect choice under pressure, because that's much too much of an expectancy to put onto ourselves as we go about. Yeah, I think you're right. Experience. Somebody wrote, "An experience is key." I think it is, because we learn from every single experience we've had or had. I think it is a huge learning curve for us, I suppose. You know, I often talk about. I said at the start about academia, about book learning. You know, or learn stereotypes, what we think we know. You know, the best example that I have on that is manual handling training in the industry. I think it's one of the most detrimental things in the security industry is how we apply manual handling training. I'm sure most of you have done a manual handling training course here, and I'm pretty sure that on most of those manual handling training courses, you were brought in and showed how to lift an empty box of paper, you know, photocopier paper, you know. And how many times since the day you did that training course have you ever had to lift an empty box of paper? You know, I've never ever been punched by an empty box of paper as I picked it up off the ground, you know. But it's only when we go out there and start trying to apply that to the real world that we realize its limitations. And that's the same with every training. It's the same. I grew up in martial arts, and when I got into the security industry, I very quickly realized the limitations of traditional martial arts. You know, you have to be able to take knowledge and skills and apply them to the real world in a way that benefits you. You know, I'm not just talking about benefiting you from a physical skills point of view, benefiting you from a way that doesn't lose you your job. You know, I'm sure anyone who's gone into the martial skills or the exoteric skills of martial arts will tell you that, you know, you've probably been taught lots and lots of techniques. You know, you can probably count on one hand the amount of times a roundhouse kick was a solution to the problem that was in front of you. You know, it probably was a solution, but it probably wasn't the solution. You know, because it would result in losing a job, etc., etc., etc. And that's one of the concepts of conflict is you have to make everything work for you. There's people on here who are very advanced medical instructors. I know at least one or two who are on here who are in that boat. You know, you always say, look, stuff learned in a classroom, you don't know if it works until you actually go out and apply it on somebody. I used to teach first aid, and I've had people come on first aid courses for 4 or 5 days, you know, come do a first aid course. And at the end, you would say to that person, you know, happy enough now you're going out and doing what you do. Oh, yeah, looking forward to it. No, well, I'll never actually do it. So what do you mean you'd never do it? So terrified of blood. You go, why would you sign up for a first aid course? It's handy skill to know, like, you know, it's just handy to know. Never do it in the real world if somebody was seriously injured. I wouldn't be able to. But, you know, I have the training now and all, you know. So they collect knowledge and skills, but they don't actually know if this applies in the real world. You know, they have no idea if it applies in the real world. I know some of you have gone through academia and college and university and stuff like that. And I found that when I went through university and stuff like that, you know, that the people who had come up with these theories had never actually tested them in the real world. You know, they don't know if they work or not in the real world. And that's the thing with conflict and how we apply conflict concepts is concepts are fantastic. But the concept that somebody puts in their book, and they could be the greatest minds in the world, you know, two what I believe to be the greatest minds in the world, Jeff Thompson, Rory Miller, those type guys. Got people still coming in here. You know, greatest mind, and they've applied it to the real world. But just because they could make it work doesn't mean I could make it work. And just because I can make something work doesn't mean you can make it work. You know, so it's about taking the concepts and the knowledge and the skills and stuff like that and applying them for you with your personality, background, body type, all that kind of stuff. You know, I know people who could read all the books in the world about posturing and how posturing works, how we make ourselves big and angry and we dominate the proxemics and we make the other person back down. Yeah. But if you're 5'2" and you have a high-pitched voice, all the posturing in the world is not going to help you. And that's just down to body type. You know? And just people who are 5'2" and have a high-pitched squeaky voice could be fantastic at other elements of conflict that I couldn't pull off. You know, no way in the world I could pull it off, some of the stuff that they do, you know. But it's taking the concepts and applying them to you, I think, is an important thing to bear in mind, I suppose. So bear in mind that most of the time when we deal with conflict, we are dealing predominantly with limbic thinking and we're trying to remain in rational control. I often talk about the 3 C's in conflict: confidence, clarity, and consequence. You know, the portrayal of conflict, even when you're not feeling confident, is huge. You know, I think one of the most underrated things in conflict management is this element of command presence. And it doesn't have a whole lot to do with physical size or anything like that. It's the arrival of a person who looks and acts like they know what they're doing. And I think confidence is a huge thing. I remember being over the years at various seminars, and as you probably guessed, I've taken a lot of my stuff from those seminars and people who were trained with over the years, great minds. And I suppose you will often come across people who will talk about, I'm sure you've all come across this concept of defense, Jeff Thompson's concept of defense and principle of defense and stuff like that. And I often talk about, you know, having the hands in front of you and managing the proxemics of your workspace and stuff like that, or as I like to call it, you know, protecting your workspace, you know, keeping that workspace sterile. And I often used to talk about taking it one step further, and confidence is about painting the fence. It's keeping your fence painted. You know, it's no good having a fence if your fence looks dilapidated and people don't believe in it. Confidence is that fresh whitewash that you put on the fence, that people actually see that the fence exists and it's in good condition. You know, and I think that's very much so. You know, the fact that what's the old saying that was drummed into me when I started off in the industry? If you look like you know what you're doing, you act like you know what you're doing, people assume you know what you're doing. And it's only a very small proportion of people who will test those skills. You know, if you look and act like you know what you're doing. You know, it's a security industry take on fake it till you make it. You know, but it is a very valid thing. You know, where you walk in and you're acting like you know what you're doing. And it doesn't have to be acting the hard man. I think somebody put in there, it's professionalism as well. It's going in there with a professionalism that shows that, yeah, look, I know what I'm talking about here. You know, I know what I'm doing. I'm capable. I'm not just capable, but I'm proficient. And you show that in your body language and everything you do. Even if you're feeling, even if you are feeling, yeah, it's a good one there. Abdul mentioned there, broken window theory and defensible space. I often equate broken window theory to conflict management. You know, if you're standing out there and you're trying to portray a very big, you know, you're trying to portray a level of professionalism, but your shirt is dirty and your trousers haven't been ironed. You know, it's the same as broken windows theory if you ever come across in criminology. You know, the building that's dilapidated attracts crime. You know, the security operative that doesn't look like they know what they're doing attracts trouble. You know, and as we all know, this is not a difficult industry to find trouble in. If you go out there looking for trouble, it will find you really, 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 really quickly. You know, so I suppose it's a case of not giving off that. You know, when I talk about when Abdul mentioned their defensible space, I think that's a very good concept to have. I talk about it as a sterile space, you know, and portraying our layers of security, you know, where we want a person to stop subliminally. And I could talk for days about body language. When we're doing the level 6 course, the level 6 conflict management course, I think I've got a full 4 hours just talking about body language and communicating through body language. And it's one of the more enjoyable parts that people get when they start being able to project body language and voice. I think that's something that only comes with confidence. You know, when we start off with body language and voice with very little experience to go with that, our defensible space ends up being probably within arm's width because that's where we're comfortable. And as we gain more experience, we learn to project our voice and project our defensible space a lot more with subliminal messages. Would you agree with that? That we end up actually controlling our personal space gets bigger. We actually get more comfortable with people closer to us, but less people come closer to us because we project their personal space subliminally. You know, without making people scared or afraid, we manage to project professionalism. You know, and that's a skill in itself. And I think it only comes with practicing it. Ken, yeah, I would go as far as to say, there's a guy called Joe Saunders in Australia. He runs a very good podcast called the Managing Violence podcast. And he wrote a very good article on it there recently. He calls it assertive courtesy. I like that term very, very well. He said, you know, it's being nice to people, but they know that you're capable enough of being nice. You know, it's kind of a spin on the Jordan Peterson phrase that he often uses about a good man. You know, if you've come across that before, he says that a good man is not a harmless man. He says a good man is a man who is capable of doing violence yet chooses not to. You know, and for the ladies in the group, I don't mean to just say man there. He's talking about all people when he's doing that. But, you know, it's knowing that you have the capacity and the proficiency to deal with a conflict, regardless of the level that conflict gets to, usually results in you being capable of managing at a lower level. Because you're confident. You don't have anything to prove to yourself. And when we're less confident in our own abilities, we end up trying to prove things to ourselves. And it often escalates conflict in my experience. You know, where you have a person that's trying to prove to themselves that they're able to manage a high risk conflict. So what do they do to prove that? They go out and engage in high risk conflict. You know, they allow manifest high risk conflicts to prove to themselves that they can do it. When the reality is, when you get really good at managing high risk conflict, you don't need to engage in high risk conflict anymore. You know you can do it. So you deal with it at a lower level. You know, because you know you can. If you wanted to, you could deal with it up there, but you don't have to. You can deal with it down there if you want to. So it gives you options, or I often talk about toolbox thinking. It gives you tools in the toolbox, and it allows you to choose the right tool for the job. When you start off, especially if you've got backgrounds in martial skills, you know, I said all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. You know, when you start off with a very select number of hard tools, you know, the tendency is to go and use those hard tools all the time. Like I say, what do? We end up driving screws with drills and hammering nails. You know, it's only after a while that we realize we have a measuring tape. You know, and if we wanted, we could probably find where that nail goes first time instead of hammering a load of nails to figure out where it goes. You know, so it's developing, it's having background knowledge, understanding the concepts that allows us to have the tools so we can choose the right tool for the job. You know, but if we don't build that underpinning knowledge and that background, you know, I often talk about when people come in, most commonly asked questions I get on the pages, on the social media pages, is about the law. You know, the same thing, if you don't have underpinning knowledge about the law, you've no good, you should not be putting yourself in a situation where you're interacting with the law. You know, and as happy as I am to answer people's questions on Facebook and LinkedIn about the law and stuff like that, you know, using the defense of some bloke on Facebook told me, and just believing that without going off and looking up your own stuff, I think is criminally stupid on your part, you know, because it isn't going to stand up in a court case. And it comes back to conflict as well, you know, just believing that something I said on a webinar or on a blog article or whatever the case might be is going to work for you. It's pretty dangerous putting your teeth on the line to prove that in a live situation, isn't it? You know, and coming back to me going, well, actually, what you said didn't work. Look, I'm missing all my teeth. That proves it didn't work. You know, without going and saying, okay, I'm going to take these concepts and say, how can I make that work for me? You know, in the grand scheme of things. So the other one is clarity, understanding that not just are we, the second C, confidence was the first, and the second one's clarity. Not just are we thinking with limbic thinking, but they are much more thinking with limbic thinking than we are. The other side, we're the conflict manager here. We have a huge advantage over the person who's arguing with us. We have the advantage of operant conditioning. And I suppose the advantage of operant conditioning that we have is that day that person is arguing with us is the first time they've ever had that argument. You know, they've never engaged in this argument. You've probably had that same argument 20, 30, 40 times over the same subject, the same cause, you know, with that person. So you're better able to control your emotion than they are. So it's about understanding, look, they're at a much higher limbic state than we are. So when we're speaking to them, we have to spell things out very, very clearly. You know, I often talk with guards, you know, Irish police officers, for those of you not in Ireland, about this concept of at the side of the road. You know, when the guard is trying to explain the law to somebody, and even with door staff when you're dealing with drunk people, you know, quoting law to a drunk person, you know, is the equivalent of quoting quantum physics to a 4-year-old. Their brain does not physically have the capacity to understand what it is that you're saying to them. And the same thing with people who are, you know, on high levels of stress when they're in stressful situations. You know, quoting complex language to them is completely pointless. Their brain is not in a position where they can soak it in. They do not have the capacity to soak it in and process it as rational thought. You know, so what we have to achieve, I suppose, is by putting ourselves in their shoes. What will a person voluntarily intoxicated? Yes, but like all the research would say, you know, or lots of research, come back to the early 60s, they have research that suggests that adrenaline and cortisol's impact on the brain, on decision making, is just as negative as alcohol is. People under high levels of stress make just as poor decisions as people consuming alcohol. You know, they make very, very strange decisions. You know, people under huge levels of stress. You know, So yeah, Abdul, yeah, voluntarily intoxicated, I think is a good phrase of putting it. So us, clarity is very, very important, but not just clarity in what we say, clarity in what we're portraying. So making sure that what we're portraying physically is matching up with the message that we're sending. In that circle of communication, when we start talking about Moravian's law in a while, or Meribam's law, however you want to pronounce his name, that what we are saying is what we are portraying. And if we're saying step back now, or I'm going to do this, that our body language supports that. And our tone supports that. If we're saying, yes, I'm here to help you, that our body language and our supports says that, people will say the most horrible things. And I don't have the slide in here, but I often talk about the scale of abuse that people throw out. Yeah. And most of us here, I'd say, probably live with significant others. And we often say the worst things to those closest to us. But we don't have to go through the motions with people closest to us. We know exactly what to say. I'm sure if you wanted to, you could leave this call today, go into your significant other, whoever that significant other is, and within 20 seconds, if you wanted to, you could start an argument. You know exactly what to say. Usually it's, for me, it's the fact that I've come home from work is what starts it off. It's just the fact. I'm saying that really quietly because she's in the other room. She hears me, I'm in trouble. So in terms of, somebody said red mist and white mist. Yeah, the same principles apply. Our logical decision making goes out the window. We say the immediate things. But when a person doesn't know us, when we're dealing with stranger conflict, I suppose, they have to go through what I call the fishing trip. They throw out fishing hooks and see what gets a reaction when it comes to conflict management. So it'll generally, for me, start off with role-based abuse. It'll be about your job, the policy, the procedure, the strategy, whatever that might be. You have a crap job. Not only do you have a crap job, you're crap at your crap job. Could you not get a real job? Did you collect tokens on a Kellogg's box for your security license? Could you not get into the police? Stuff like that. How many years in college do you have to do to work in security? It's about the job. And most of us don't hold enough value on our job to argue back with people about that. There's not many people that'll ever say, don't you dare talk about my security industry like that. Or have like a PSA logo tattooed on their arm or something like that, things like that, just to make themselves feel special and part of the club, Then when they don't get a reaction, because most of us aren't, they'll move to personal abuse. It becomes about you as an individual. You're fat, bald, ugly, and stupid. That was me leaving the house this morning. And it doesn't even have to make sense to people. It just has to make them feel better. Most personal abuse is not designed to make you feel bad. It's designed to make them feel better. So when they have that situation where they walk away, that dominant personality, their win, they've blatantly lost the argument, but they can go and sit in their car and talk to their friends in the pub and say, yeah, I didn't get in, or yeah, I didn't get what I wanted, or yeah, I didn't get the refund, but I made him feel bad. And that's their win. It's not about making you feel bad. It's about making them feel better about having lost. And it doesn't even have to make sense. A friend of mine's ex-military, and we were standing on a bar door one night, and across the road, this guy shouts over him, look at you standing there with your shiny shoes in you. Now, when you have a man at a stage where the only thing they can insult is the shininess of your shoes, that you've basically won that argument, and there's no point in engaging with that person any further. But it makes him feel better to say that from across the road. He's in front of his mates, and his mates can go, yeah, you told him. And that makes him feel better. That's his win. You're going to have to excuse the language. I'll tone it down a little bit. But one of my personal favorites, when I worked in bars and nightclubs, people used to think I was Eastern European for some reason. I used to always get, go back to your own country and stuff like that. I'm kind of going, where do you want me to go? Basically homeless if I don't live here, But we'd refused entry to a hotel to this gentleman one night, and he stands across the road and he shouts across the road, why don't you F off back to Poland, you Hungarian pig? And I'm looking at him going, we were calling him geographically challenged. He didn't know what country he was in, But the guy who was with me saying, are you going to let him talk to you like that? And I was going, there's literally no point in arguing with that man. He doesn't know where he is, But they will say the most horrible stuff. And when it moves on from that type of abuse, it will move up to what I call peripheral abuse. People in your periphery, in your circle, So, thanks, Stephen. I appreciate that. I'm not even going to say that out loud. So, when it comes to people in your periphery, it could be your colleagues. And research has shown, behavioral science research, very interesting, would say that we are more likely to intervene for a colleague being abused at an earlier stage than we would have ourselves been subjected to the abuse. Who would agree with that? That you'd step in at an earlier stage if you saw your partner being abused than you would if it was you, because they have that protective nature. It's amazing, isn't it? But peripheral abuse could extend to, like you said, your colleague, or it could get even nastier. Your kids, your family, your mother, your wife, your husband. I grew up in Dublin, and basically when I grew up in Dublin as a teenager, all you really needed to win most arguments with your mates was a good your mother joke. If you're half decent your mother joke, you're going to win most arguments with your mates. Some fella goes, ha, you fell off your bike. Yeah, well, your mother's fat, so. And I automatically win that argument, Unless he's willing to punch me in the face, I win that argument, because you just don't go there with people, and that gets most of the that wins most arguments for people, But it can move to peripheral, and you can say the most horrible things about your kids. Why did they say that? Because they know that that's most likely going to get a reaction. Now, bear in mind that they don't even know whether you have kids or not when they say that. They're not shouting at what you are. They're not shouting at who you are. They're shouting at what you are. They shout at what you represent. And keeping that composure, somebody's put it in there, composure, is quite an important one. Why? Because the third word, professional consequence. The third C is consequence. So we had confidence, we had clarity, now we have consequence. And consequence, I think, is one of the biggest things in conflict. As long as a person does not see a consequence of their action, the action will continue in most cases. Why? Because it is being successful. It's doing for them, it is achieving a goal for them, shouting, roaring, calling you names. And professional consequence is a huge thing. What is the consequence to the customer, service user, clown, whatever you want to call him, not nice guy, standing at the in front of you, to shouting, roaring, and screaming in your face? What is the consequence to them? Very, very little. What's the worst that's going to happen to them in their eyes? When we have them in a proxemic position, especially where there's alcohol involved, the ideal situation for conflict, how does conflict like to exist? It exists in lines and tunnels. Our ideal thing for having an argument is where we're standing more than arm's width away from a person, and we can see all the weapons that they might use to harm us. So where a person is more than arm's distance, they're perfectly happy to stand there and trade insults. They know they're physically safe, and they know there's a professional consequence to us. No consequence to them to shouting, roaring, screaming. Huge consequence to us to reacting. And there are far too many security people, ex-security people, sitting on dole queues and other jobs that they never wanted to do because they reacted to some person who didn't even merit a reaction. And some guy now is sitting at home with a grin on his face, knowing that he cost you a job. And you basically handed the win to them by losing your head. The ultimate satisfaction. As long as they're shouting, roaring, screaming their head off, they're burning off adrenaline, posturing, loopholing, all the things we would talk about in de-escalation techniques, so I'm not going to get into on this. As long as they are doing that, there's no consequence to them and no consequence to you. As soon as you react, you introduce the consequence. You get to introduce the consequence regardless. It's whether that consequence is positive or negative for you is what's important. And we talk about in a couple of minutes introducing that consequence and how we introduce that consequence into a situation. So we talk about, I think somebody mentioned there a while ago, I believe it was yourself, Abdul, about introducing, what's it required? A conflict requires three things to happen. It requires opportunity, it requires motivation, and most of all, it requires intent or willingness. The only two that we can affect are these two here: motivation and opportunity. A person's motivation or reason for having an argument with us, and their opportunity to do so. This one up here we can't. That's willingness, intent. A person is either willing to or not willing to engage in an argument over a particular topic, and we've no control over that. Values and beliefs is what controls that, and we have no idea what their values and belief system. I'm going to do a quick poll with you guys, and if you're listening on a podcast, you can have a think about this. You leave this webinar today, or you finish up listening to us, you walk down the street, and as you're walking down the street, you observe a man hitting a woman. How many people would physically intervene to stop a man hitting a woman? Show of hands, or just give me a thumbs up or a comment. Domestic, boyfriend, girlfriend. How many people? Got one, a couple of people. Same scenario. The silent people have obviously dealt with domestics before. Yeah, we got a few people there. Same situation. You are walking down the street today after you finish up here, and you observe a parent hitting a child. How many people would intervene physically? All people. No, I'd be surprised, Abdul, if all people. How many people would intervene to stop a person hitting a child, a parent hitting a child? A few no's, yeah. And somebody else coming in. Very few, yeah, you're right, Kieran, I think, yeah. Everyone should, yeah, but should is a big thing, yeah. That's a tough one, yeah, it is a tough one. And walking down the street today, and you see a person kicking a small dog, how many people would physically intervene to stop that from happening? Every hand in the group goes up. Every 37 people. So about half the group put their hand up to say they'd intervene to stop a man hitting his girlfriend. And double the amount would do that to stop a person hitting a child. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just values and beliefs and experiences that you've had. You know, those responses are based on experiences that you've had. And somebody mentioned something in there. I can't remember who it was. It was about everybody should. And there's a big difference between should and would. And that's that difference again. We'll go back to the difference in capability and proficiency. I remember listening to a talk about very recently about a person said that they had a person in their neighborhood who was convicted of sex crimes, and they'd been sent to prison for it. And as it was leading up to the trial, everybody in the place was there. He's a monster. You know, if I see him, because he's been sent to prison, when I see him, I'm going to do this. When I see him, I'm going to do that. Somebody should do this to him. So your man goes away, he goes to prison, and he comes back out there recently, and he's back in the neighborhood. And he's again doing terrible things. He's harassing people and annoying people and stuff like that. And those same people are sitting in the bars and passing them on the street, and they're looking at him. They're all saying, somebody should do something. And that's where we come in, you know, security practitioners. Everybody says somebody should. Unfortunately, nobody wants to be the somebody until you sign on the dotted line and you're the somebody. You put the badge on, you put the jacket on, and you're the somebody. And the expectation is that you're going to do something. So when people are, you know, coming in and they're in a vulnerable situation, the expectation is that you're the person who's going to do something. You know, and for everybody in this course, you have to decide whether you are or not. There's no shame in saying I'm not. But like I said at the start, we have to risk assess against that. If you're not willing to put your safety at risk to save or protect a complete stranger in a defined set of circumstances, then you need to risk assess against that in the roles that you're signing up for. And there's no shame in that. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. In fact, I would much prefer if many people over the years had come out to me and said, sorry, boss, not for me, and walked away, instead of waiting for 2 or 3 months when something happens and abandoning their colleagues and somebody gets hurt because of it. You know, so it goes back to that self-awareness. Again, being self-aware to recognize your strengths and your weaknesses and either accepting them or working on them. You know, but not just saying, yeah, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. So the motivation and opportunity we would look at kind of a technical level. De-escalation stuff works down here. Deterrence and obstacles work with opportunity. At motivation, we can de-escalate and communicate. At opportunity, at higher levels where it moves to aggressive and violence, all we can do is remove opportunity, either by leaving, by rotation, by force of numbers, or by physical intervention. They're really our only tools when it comes to high-risk conflict. And I suppose one of the concepts I always try to get across to people when it comes to high-risk conflict as opposed to low-risk conflict, I'm a big fan of the belief that most, probably 80 to 90%, can be dealt with at a motivational level. We can de-escalate. But one of the worst mistakes that you can make is not recognizing when a situation has gone beyond being talked out of. And I've seen a significant amount of people over the years get hurt trying to talk themselves out of a situation that was long gone past being talked out of. You know, self-awareness is key, you know, because there's a consequence to both parties from conflict management or from conflict. I think a hugely important thing that's not very well known in the security industry is this here. This is, has anyone ever come across, if anyone ever has, I really highly recommend the work of Judith Glaser. Has anyone ever come across Judith Glaser before in conflict management? She unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. She's got a fantastic book called Conversational Intelligence. She worked a lot with children from disadvantaged neighborhoods around gaining trust and helping that trust in education. And she says that oftentimes when we engage in a person who has had an adrenal response, they found themselves in a bad position and they're engaged in an adrenal response, they're full of cortisol and they're full of adrenaline and they're acting on a level of low trust. And regardless of what we say to them, they have no reason to believe us because they're in a low trust situation. So before we can solve a situation, we have to build trust with that person. And that trust can be either transactional or transformational. You know, transactional, I believe in you enough to give you this so that you give me that. You know, that's transactional information. I believe in you enough to tell you my name and date of birth so that you will allow me to access. You know, or transformational, that they absolutely trust you and they're willing to give you the information to help them. Now, lots of problems can be dealt with at transactional level, but there are some that you have to understand. Look, unless a person trusts you, you're not going to be able to solve a problem. And that's why we talked about that cohesiveness between body language and what we're saying to a person. Because people are much more instinctually listen to our body language and our tone rather than what we're actually saying. And we might be saying all the right things, but if our body language doesn't support that, then it's kind of pointless. They have a fantastic podcast based on a work called the Conversation Intelligence Podcast. It's very, very, very good, I have to say. But she talks about, well, building trust within the conversation and that people trust people. Congruence, not organizations. And one of the first things that we should attempt, and I have it in the tips and strategies section later on, one of the key and most powerful things that we have as a concept in building trust is a force name. And one of the first things I teach when I'm teaching conflict management at a tactical level, tips and tricks level, is force name. I often say, get it early and use it often. You know, so getting a force name and having a force name, even if it's not a real force name, is very powerful to us. Because all of a sudden, it's not a customer and a security person, or a service user and a security person, or an aggressor and a security person. It's Tony and Mick. You know, and when you can get that force name early and use it often. So I try to throw it in every 2 or 3 sentences. I get what you're saying, Mick. You know, and I throw it in every couple of sentences, especially when you're dealing with low-level stuff, you know, refund issues, stuff like that for the retail security, or manipulation, as I like to call it. You know, people often talk about manipulation being a bad thing. Manipulation is a very positive thing. How many times, those of you who work in the close protection industry, have you used manipulation to get you something in a hotel or a venue, you know, for your client or VIP that you probably weren't entitled to? You know, how many times have you used manipulation to get a client to do something that they didn't want to do? You know, we manipulate all the time. Sales is purely manipulation. You know, it's it's selling people a solution. The security industry is based on manipulation. You know, it's selling people a solution to a problem that they don't know they have. You know, that's what we do. We sell people. If we are good at our job, people don't know that they have a security problem. So we have to continually sell them a solution to a problem that they don't realize they have. Otherwise, we become meaningless. You know, and that's become so important in the last while with budgets getting tightened and stuff like that. You know, people saying, yeah, look, we don't really have a security problem anymore. You have the same security problem you always have. You just have other problems that appear higher in risk rating than it, you know. And the same thing comes across in conflict. By being able to show them that they, you know, that we're there to help them, we show them, look, we know you have this problem. Yeah, nobody sees their own flaws unless they have them. And the same thing in conflict, you have to say, like, there's 3 parts to every conflict. Your side, their side, and in the middle is the reality. You know, because their brain doesn't operate on reality, it operates on perception. You know, all of their amygdalic, limbic responses is based on perception. You know, how do we know that? It's a great phrase, and it's attributed to Mark Twain. It's often put out there. He had this phrase that I've been worried about very many things in my life, most of which have never happened. You know, our brain operates on worst case scenario. when we engage in any type of conflict, regardless of whether it's low level or high level, our brain prepares them for the worst case scenario. So when you're dealing with a customer or a service user, they've entered that conversation with all their preconceptions and stereotypes of what a security person is and was. And you're automatically starting from that preconception. So if they've had previous bad experiences, they're starting. They've worked themselves up that a security person is a bad person who's a thug and a bully. And that's where they're starting from. You know, so we have to gain that trust before we know it. It's like any industry, I suppose. 20% of the industry doing their job poorly, Pareto's principle. 20% of any industry doing its job poorly will give the other 80% a bad name. And us as the 80% who are professionals and want to do the right thing suffer because of the actions of the 20%. Because of the preconceptions that are formed when the 20% appear on social media. So people see us as low trust because of the actions of the 20%. It's the visible actions of the 20%. Nobody notices a security person who opens the door, says hello, says thank you. Everybody remembers the guy who they saw drop kicking your man on social media. You know? So we are automatically starting from a position of low trust. So one of the things we can do to gain that high trust, somebody says that name, you know, we're no longer security now, we're John or Mick, you know, so that's all the one thing. We're starting to build that trust. And we stop talking in terms of me and you and start talking in terms of we. You know, all right, Mick, sorry, what was your own name? Mick, I'm John. Let's see what we can do here to sort this for you. You know, so we're getting a first name and we're talking on we terms all of a sudden, you know, and that's one of the first things I say, to start building trust. But we can't solve a problem at low trust. We have to build the trust first before we solve the problem. They have to see what the problem is, what the real problem is, before we can solve it for them. Yeah, we can't solve a problem that doesn't exist in their head. You know, yeah, when you start seeing risk and threat assessments, unfortunately, when it comes to perception, people perceive at their own level. You know, it's like we do this thing called pre-morteming, where we work ourselves up and prepare ourselves for the worst case scenario. Like when you're that drive to the dentist, when you're driving towards the dentist, and we work ourselves up, we start thinking about the pain and how bad it's going to be and how horrible it's going to be. And when you get there, like the actual act is not as bad as the situation, you know, that you work yourself up into, you know. But we have to, I suppose, gain that person's trust so that we can show them what the real problem is, because they're coming from a problem of perception, their perception, and we're coming at it from a problem of perception. You know, so until we get to what the actual problem is, we're never going to be able to solve the problem. And the starting point is trust. We have to get that trust. And there's a couple of strategies that we use later on to do that, which I'll show. I'm not going to go too much into the channels or Moravian's law. Suffice to say that everybody knows, or most people will have come across this before, that 55% of the message that we portray or the message that we interpret about people, we interpret through body language. But it's how we interpret that body language is important. 38% is, they call it tone, but I prefer to refer to it as attitudinal tones. We read into a person's attitude and tone of voice in the first second and a half or so, and then only 7% in the words. And people are not inclined to believe your words unless it's portrayed, congruence, as Stephen said earlier, unless it's congruent with the rest of us. But I suppose it's, where do we make this judgment on what a person's like, this initial judgment on what the person's like based on their body language? And how we do it is we do it based on stereotype. We don't do it based on individuals. We judge stereotypes. We judge it emphatically, very quickly, with the limbic system of the brain based on a quick risk assessment of the type of person that person is. And the danger that exists is that we don't often understand our own stereotypes. We don't know we have them. You know, we all have biases and stereotypes, and we have two different types. I often talk about experiential and learned stereotypes. We all have experiential stereotypes. They're usually really, really accurate. They are stereotypes that we have built up based on experiences that we have had. And they're usually really, really accurate because we've lived it. We know it to be true. You know? And then the other ones are learned stereotypes. They're ones that we think we know, but we've never actually tried, tested, or lived. And the danger with those is that we're relying on somebody else's experiences to tell us. And what works for them may not necessarily work for us. The famous motivational speaker, Jim Rohn. Has anyone come across Jim Rohn from the early 70s? I believe he was out. He was like Tony Robbins' mentor and stuff. He used to do this exercise where you get people in a room and say, okay, guys, stand up if you're afraid of rats. And 2/3 of the room would stand up. So, okay, of those of you who are standing up, sit back down again if you've never seen a rat. Or if you've ever seen a rat, I apologize. And about half of them would sit back down again. So now you're left about 1/3 of the room standing up who are afraid of rats but had never seen one. You know? And that's perception in action, like, you know. They believe what they think they know and they form opinions based on that. And that's what we all do when we don't know, you know, when we don't know any different from people. And that's where we judge our stereotypes from. So it's important to recognize that we all have stereotypes, and that's that bounded rationality again. You know, we're making assumptions in bounded rationality based on our stereotypes and our biases and our own inherent beliefs about what's right and wrong. And that comes across in our attitude. And I suppose as professionals, I suppose we have to be aware of that comes across and how that impacts on what we call the Bataras box, or the attitude behavior cycle. And the attitude behavior cycle will tell us that your attitudes, your beliefs, your stereotypes and your biases will impact upon your behavior. And your behavior will impact upon the other person's attitude. How you treat them, how you behave will impact on how they think of you, which in turn will affect their behavior, and it turns into a vicious cycle. Now, by far the easiest one to change is behavior, because behavior is an individual choice. We can choose to change our behavior at any given point. We can choose to treat a person nicely, even though we don't necessarily like the person. And that's manipulation again. And that affects the attitude over a long period of time, but it will never solve it completely. So I suppose one of the things we do quite quickly when we engage in this, when we're reading body language, is one of the concepts I often put across is this concept of situational awareness in action, you know, and how we quickly read situations, you know. So we often talk that when we're scanning, when our limbic system is scanning and our amygdala is looking around for signals, we often rely on prior knowledge and internal risk assessments. And that bases our situational awareness then, when it perceives a risk, goes, okay, well, how dangerous is it and have I done it before? You know, in this context, how dangerous is it and have I done it before? Based on the task itself, the individuals involved, and the environment I find myself in. And then it goes up to the logical brain. It goes, well, you've done it before. What has worked before? In terms of, did you need support? What was your exit strategy? What was your own level of ability and stuff? And it becomes a planned response. But all of this only works if we go right back to the very first that we did here, if we are cognizant of interpersonal conflict. That oftentimes when we're doing this scanning section of situational awareness, it's influenced by the last situation we've been involved in. And if we're still clouded with adrenaline and cortisol, that is certainly going to influence us. So I suppose some of the tools and strategies that we have, and I want to move through this quite quickly because I'm aware we're running out of time. Obviously getting a first name we talked about earlier on, getting a first name, using it early and often. And then one of the other concepts we often talk about is controlling the burn, you know. So controlling that burning off of adrenaline, I think, is a very appropriate one. And one of the most powerful tools that I've used over the years, and I think it's fantastic, when I worked in hotel security, I used to use this on a regular basis, is a pen and paper. I think a pen and paper is one of the most powerful tools that you can have for managing conflict on a number of levels. So as soon as that notebook comes out or pen and paper comes out and into your hand, I think it does a number of things. One, it shows that we're listening to that other human being as a concept, you know, that we're engaged and we're building trust. The second thing, it absolutely engages our rational brain. Writing is one of the most powerful tools that we have, one of the most rational tools we have. There's no other creature on the planet that can do it. So it requires a lot of engaged rational thinking. So when we take out that pen and paper, it helps keep us. Shows empathy, allows us to show empathy. So we're writing what they're saying, we're taking notes, we're listening. Yeah, I got that. Yeah. It allows us to control the burn. So we can control the burn of the conversation. Because under stress, when we have adrenaline and cortisol, we tend to talk quicker and louder. When we're writing, it allows us to pace them back again. So we can say, okay, just hang on a second there. I just want to make sure I'm getting what you're saying here. And we can control the burn of the conversation. And then when we get to the end, we can completely let that burn out, because what we can do at the end is say, okay, now what I've got written down here is point 1, point 2, point 3, and point 4. So I just want to clarify, did I understand you correctly there? And they now have to go back now, when I give them those point 1, point 2, point 3, and point 4, and ask them, did I understand that correctly? They have to engage the part of the brain that deals with understanding. And they have to repeat back going, did I mean to say that? Is that what I meant to say? Is that something that works for me? Whatever the case may be. Gives us a written record of the events. And they go, yeah, perfect venting. No, we let them burn off that bit at the end. And at the end, they can go, no, actually what I meant to say was, and they can finish off that burn. So only when we've allowed the venting to go, when they've burned off that adrenaline and cortisol, is their brain now in a position to start listening to solutions. At the beginning, when they had all that adrenaline to burn off, they had to burn it off so their brain could actually have the capacity to deal with a solution. Once they vent, their brain is in a position to accept solutions now. And this is where a model that I've liked for a while, I suppose, comes in. The model is called Leo. It's not my own or anything. It's been used for decades as far as I can find out. Leo is listen, empathize, options. So we've listened, we've wrote down, we showed empathy, yeah, I know what you're saying there, I understand, yeah. And now we're going to deliver options. And one of the most powerful sayings I've ever come across in conflict management, I think it actually comes from Sigmund Freud originally, or it's attributed to Sigmund Freud originally. He said that even when all options are bad, options are good. The ability to offer options is often a very, very good thing. Even when all options are bad, options are good. So we've listened, we've empathized. Okay, so this is what your problem is. Okay, so what I can offer to you now is option 1, 2, and 3. And none of those might be what they want, but I don't even mention what they can't have. I don't even mention, they come in here saying, I want to do this and I want to do that. I listen to them, I take the notes, I understand the problem, and they go, okay, what's available is 1, 2, 3. I don't bother with what they can't have. I'll tell them what is available. Do any of those solutions work for us? And again, us. Can we adapt any of those solutions to make them work for us? Have a think about, is there any of those that would make you at least remotely happy? And they might still say no. They might say, well, actually this one, yeah, might work for me, and we've offered them an option. Well, there's a solution, we've offered you a solution, And even if none of them, even if it's not a good solution, I've handed them back to control by giving them options and going, option 1, 2, and 3, which do you pick? We give them the illusion of control. They feel like they're solving the problem. They feel like they're in charge. I pick option 3. Who picked it? I did. I told that security person this is what I was going to do. So they have that illusion of control. We give them back a slight little bit of I like to call it the illusion of control. We've actually shown them exactly what one we want to pick by giving them what we call the option sandwich. I generally don't like to give too many options. I generally stick to an even number of options, 2 or 4 if I can, and I'll always start with a good option, give them a bad option, and then reinforce the good again. Classic example I usually give when I'm giving trainings, asking somebody to leave a bar. Look, you can step outside, you can step outside, we can have a talk about this like gentlemen. Or you can refuse, in which case my colleagues and I is going to have to remove it. I really wouldn't like that to happen. Can we step outside and talk like gents? And when he goes, right, come on, and steps outside, he feels like he's chosen to go outside with you. Because we've given him a good option, given him a bad option, and emphasized, he might still pick the bad. No, I'm not going. In which case then we go to, we've done listen, we've done our notes, we've done our outcomes, and we have a valid record of what's after happening. It might be a difficult conversation about a complaint or whatever the case might be. And then, allowing them the right to be wrong. Yeah. Giving a person, like we said, go back to Miller's tree, giving a person an easy way to lose, a way to lose that they don't lose face, a way to lose that's acceptable to them, that they can go home and tell their mates and their friends and their family, I picked this, and they can be at least have a little bit of satisfaction when they go outside. Stephen's response is kill CCTV and go nuclear. Yes, the old ninja death touch, Stephen. Solution to every problem. So then it comes to, they might still choose the bad option. Then it's outcomes. Look, that's all I was able to offer you. I've offered you a number of options. I'm still hoping you're going to take them. you know. But if you don't, this is what's unfortunately going to happen, you know. And we've given them all the notice in the world. But when it comes back to it, and the complaint comes in the next day, or the issue comes in the next day about conflict, you know, and I'm going on to reasonable force now a little bit, you know, but I always say when it comes to reasonable force that reasonable force is a concept, and people don't get in trouble for what they do. They get in trouble for how they explain what they did. You know, it comes back to, well, look, these are the options that I gave to this customer. This is the options that I gave. And I'm not talking about a bar situation, because you're not going to be out writing notes. But, you know, I'm talking about in a customer thing. Hang on, you're not knowing I'm going to take out my notebook. You know, it's having a tool in the toolbox for your customer complaints or whatever the case might be when you're dealing with them. So in terms of when we give people those outcomes, okay, look, this is not a problem I can solve for you today. This is not a problem I'm going to solve today in the way that we wanted to solve it. We now have to go, like we said, to other options or whatever the case might be. But at least you've given them all the options in the world. And even when it goes nuclear, as Stephen liked to put it, and we have to use physical skills, whether it doesn't matter what the environment is, we're still always giving them the options. Even when we're using physical skills, we're going to, do you want to leave? Or do you want to come in, whatever the case might be? You know, we're still giving those options. Yeah, I do. Okay, well, let's do that then. You know, we can always go back to those ones. So in terms then, I often talk about some of the other strategies that can be effective, but that can also have, I suppose, negatives to them as well. That false control we talked about there is some negatives to that as well, in that, you know, if a person feels like they're too much in control, they can think they're actually in control. Posturing, we said earlier on, posturing has its pros and cons, in that some people can see posturing as being, I suppose, intimidatory if it's done incorrectly. One of the ones that I often like to use, and again, it operates on the limbic system as well, I like to call the time traveler, using the time traveler technique, taking a person into the future and then bringing them back to it again. Because when it comes to consequence under stress, people don't see long-term consequence. You know, all they see is the immediate consequence. They don't see the long-term consequence of their actions. So sometimes we have to take the person in, take them on a bit of time travel into the future and back again to help them make a decision. You know, so a person shouting, roaring and screaming, and we did a little bit there a minute ago. The good example, I was training with some retail security people recently. We were talking about arrests, you know, how do we get them to come back inside the shop? You know, for us, you know, those options out on the street. Listen, we can walk back inside the shop now. The alternative to that is the guards is going to arrive here. All these people are going to be looking at you. You're going to be putting handcuffs and put in the back of a guard car in front of all those people. Cameras, phones, everything's going to be out. I really don't want you to be embarrassed by that. Much easier if we take it inside. But it's no good saying to them, I have to make them feel the feeling they're going to feel when somebody's videoing them being put in the back of a guard car or a squad car in handcuffs. You have to work on the emotion. They're in the emotional state of mind. So you have to elicit the feeling. You have to talk about the embarrassment. It's going to be mortifying. You know, same with the physical skills one. You know, look, we'd like to walk out. Unfortunately, if you don't walk out, and you're saying this in quite a nice way, unfortunately, if you don't walk out, myself and my colleagues are going to have to take hold of you. We're going to have to restrain you, bring you through all these people, take you outside, and possibly have you arrested. And that's your name in the newspaper, and all your family and friends are going to see that. I'd much rather be walked out the door though. But you have to make them feel the feeling, the embarrassment on the bad option. Otherwise, they don't get it. If you talk to them on a logical level when they're in an emotional state of mind, they don't get it. You know? And when the person, even if it's an office situation and they come in here shouting, roaring, screaming into the office situation, you know, it's often a case of, well, how do we manage that? Well, listen, if you continue like this, it's not going to be. The old fashioned, I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to keep it. One of the people, for people listening on the podcast, the most helpful that Stephen can be here is, have you ever picked up your teeth with broken fingers? Hammer nail again, Stephen. I like that one. It's about as original as it gets. But then when we take them out of that, we have to take them back to that good option again. Look, let's just walk, you know. And then once that situation is solved, it's all right, Stephen, we won't say your second name. It could be any Stephen. So once that situation is solved, then we have to look at, well, how do we manage the stress of it? And I'm going to wrap this up in 5 minutes and put it open for you guys to come in if you want. So I suppose it's in recognizing some of the stuff that will lead to what we call stress and fragility after conflict. So sometimes your style of management will lead into it. I think this is a hugely overlooked one in the industry. Fatigue is a hugely overlooked one in the industry, I think. As humans, I suppose, as security professionals, we are paid to be professionals, which means that we are paid to operate the exact same at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning as we do at 11 o'clock on Friday night. We're paid to operate at the exact same level, in terms of emotions, in terms of how we manage ourselves and stuff like that. As humans, we are not the same human at 9 o'clock Monday morning as we are at 11 o'clock Friday night. You're getting paid the same salary at the same rate, at the same level of profession, but you're not the same human. We have fatigue, we have tiredness, we have personability, we have metabolic system and stuff like that, and all that impacts us. And I suppose we're never going to change that. It's about recognizing it and putting in place the things that we need to do to manage that a little bit. Because if we don't manage that, we will eventually suffer the effects of it. And in my experience, stress and fragility usually manifests itself in one of two ways. We either burn out or we lash out. And I've seen far too many good people in the course of my career lose jobs and livelihoods because of both of those. They burn out and they get physically sick of the job. And we mentioned earlier on, they either burn out and they end up going to work in Starbucks. No disrespect to Starbucks or McDonald's or something like that, serving behind the counter because it's less stress. In my experience at the security profession, most people don't leave the security profession because of a one-off high-risk incident of violence. They leave the security profession because of a build-up of low-risk, high-consistency violence. Constantly being shouted at, constantly subjected to long shifts while being shouted at. And I think, certainly people will say the company, somebody made a very good point, shifting mindsets, going from retail by day to doors at night. It's not just a long shift, it's an absolute shift in mindset. We saw that at the start of this COVID pandemic. Door staff getting involved in retail security. If you've done 10 years of door work and you shift all of a sudden, you're standing inside the door of Aldi staring at L1s buying cornflakes. Yeah, not today, love. Yeah. Managing the queue at Aldi. ID people walking into the alcohol aisle in Aldi. So before they even get there. So that shift in mindset is fatiguing, it's tiring, it's exhausting. So we have to manage ourselves. And that brings me on to the last point I often make about stress and fragility, which is lifestyle choices. I think personally, and I've been as guilty of anyone as this over the years, is, our lifestyle choices impact on our stress and conflict levels. How physically, emotionally, and mentally fit we choose to keep ourselves. And I go back to what I said earlier on. If you do not choose to look after yourself, you have no business putting yourself in a position to look after other people. And I'm not talking about everybody being super fit. I'm talking about you having a level of physical, mental, and emotional fitness that allows you to operate in your job at the level of risk that you work in. I think that's hugely important, and it does deal with, I think that helps build resilience. That exposure to cortisol and exposure to adrenaline that we do, or that lack of sleep. So conditioning ourselves, not just conditioning to it, I suppose, but taking advantage of it when we can. And, I suppose sometimes a little bit of self-awareness and recognizing that, look, I need a break before I burn out or lash out. And it goes back to that collaborative approach again. Being self-aware enough to know when you need help. And that help might not come in one single situation of high-risk aggression or violence. It might simply be you've just had a long week of low-level, high-consistency violence. And I'm talking about violence here in the purest term. I got this from Dr. Richard Disson on a podcast. He told, I think it was on Joe Saunders' podcast, he mentioned about one of the old philosophers, and I've read the paper since, a guy called Gulang, and he said that the definition of violence is anyone where you're restrained from your full potential. Restraining anyone from their full potential is an act of violence. And I think sometimes we do violence upon ourselves a little bit because we go to work restraining ourselves from our full potential because we haven't looked after ourselves for the previous week, month, or whatever the case may be. I'm not talking about physically, I'm talking about emotionally and mentally, and that's what often results in more conflict for us. How we actually look after ourselves mentally will dictate intrapersonal, again, go back to the very start, how we deal with out there. So I suppose some of the stuff we can do to wrap it up, I suppose, in terms of resilience practice, I also have physical fitness, we said, stress inoculation. I often talk about with people, building up low levels of stress. I worked up until the pandemic starts with a lot of nightclubs and bars around the country, building plans like that, building scenario-based training for them that they could ramp up over time. Because me going in and doing a seminar with a nightclub or a bar once a year for a day teaches them very little in terms of how they're going to perform 6 months later when something kicks off. What does it teach them? It teaches them a set of underpinning knowledge and skills, but unless they start applying that in gradually rising stress, I think, without mentioning Terry's second name, you have this concept of micro training down to a T, in the thing that you're trying to do. I haven't seen it in action, obviously, but, it's a hugely important thing, that thing of micro training, getting down to the micro level and seeing little bits of your concepts and how they work and building them together into a system that works for you, and I think that's often overlooked in places, looking at those what if situations and applying them then in higher and higher levels of stress, until you can do it at a proficient level, not just at a capable level, at a capability level. Personal debrief, I think, is a huge one, especially for lone workers, guys that are left on their own in fast food joints, bars and stuff like that. The ability to not have to rely on others to debrief you in a situation. Because as we all know, on a Saturday night at 4 a.m. in the morning, nobody's coming to answer the phone to help you. When you're feeling, worn out and drained after a hard day or a hard night, and you're lying awake at night, worrying about stuff that's happened that day. Am I going to get in trouble? I think one of the biggest worries for people in the security industry, I often think, is not the personal worry or fear of danger. It's the fear of losing a livelihood, I think, is a huge fear. And that's certainly something that's kept me awake at night over the years when I've been involved in situations over the years, thinking if a complaint comes in, bills, mortgage, rent, much more so than I'd gladly put myself in a situation, sometimes I would say bravely, sometimes stupidly, where my safety is at risk. Because I know I've got a skill set that's going to match that, but a situation that's out of my control, my manager holds my ability to retain my home and pay my bills in their hands based on the decision that they'll make. So I think the ability to do a personal debrief on it, I think, is a huge thing. What did I do well? What did I do badly? What will I do differently next time? Those 3 questions, I think, are huge at the end of an instant or the end of a night. Where I was head doorman in a lot of places and some very, very big nightclubs, I would sit down with people at the end of the night and I would have that with them when they're writing their incident reports. Before they do their incident report, long before they do their incident reports, have a think about this. Don't tell me, don't tell anyone next to you. What you do well, what you do badly, what you learn from it. Have a think about it for 30 seconds. Then write your incident report. Because what does that do? That engages from the emotional brain where you're going, that was crap. That was a crap night. Those 3 questions engage the rational brain. And all of a sudden now when you're writing your statement, rational brain is engaged. I think they're a huge thing to be able to sit down at the end of a night, even in your car before you go home to your family, before you take it out when people are home because you're full of stress. What to do well, what to do badly, what did I learn? What will I do differently? Those questions, I think, are a huge thing. And then the last one I'm not going to spend all that time on is mindfulness. I think in the security industry, I'll come to your question, the second part I got there. In the security industry, I think mindfulness is one of those subjects that's really taboo still, and it's something that I think everyone should look up if anyone wants some information on it. I actually teach now with ICSA a program on mindfulness and resilience for frontline workers. Teaching them how to manage the stress of the job that they're in, because oftentimes we talk about, yes, de-escalation and avoidance and stuff like that, but there is certainly a team out there that conflict is certainly unavoidable in certain circumstances, and you just have to be resilient to it. I think mindfulness is something that certainly helps. It's certainly something that helped me over the years. I've been involved in martial arts since a very young age, and certainly things like the esoteric martial arts, the Budo, the mindfulness that goes with that is something that certainly benefited me over the years. For people starting off, I usually recommend an app called Headspace. It's been a massive benefit to loads of frontline professionals that I've worked with over the years. It's nothing to do with sitting in the corner in your pajamas on a cushion. You can do it in 30 seconds or 30 minutes. You know, and I think, it certainly allows you to detach yourself. That's the one thing that I got from Keith. It certainly allows you to detach yourself in situations that you'd otherwise be emotionally involved with. And somebody up further said, certainly when you're talking to the guards, and I think that hugely benefited me over the years in how I explained my situations to the authorities and to managers afterwards. I was able to detach myself, and that was a huge advantage to me and a huge advantage to them. You know, because I was able to give a detached, lack of emotion account of my actions, even in a very stressful situation. So that's me wrapping it up for tonight. We got 5 minutes left. I kind of overrun. I was hoping for 10 minutes. Thoughts, questions, actions, criticisms. I'm not sensitive. Please feel free to throw them in. Pat, I see you have a question there. I'm going to get to it in a second. Anybody got any situation or incident they want to throw in or anything like that? Questions, queries? Silence. I like silence. That either means it was really good or really bad. Everyone stayed, which is always positive. Thanks, Ken. So, look, I would say it's a lot of people refusing to wear masks in public places. Yeah, certainly, yeah. It certainly is. And again, that's just a value judgment. Somebody had a question there on masks and how we encourage people to wear masks and things like that. I think sometimes we have to go with that behavior change thing. You know, that there's a certain minority who you're not going to change their behavior. And all we can do with that minority is deterrence value, if that makes sense. You know, this is the rule, and you're going to abide by that rule. Anybody else got anything they want to throw in before I wrap it up? Happy? Did everyone get something? I'm kind of hoping that everybody got something from it. Even if, or everyone at least laughed at some of Stephen's comments, if nothing else. And other people. So look, I'll go back to the very start again, just to say thanks very much for taking 2 hours out of your evening to come here. I have slides and stuff like that to send on, that I'm going to send on to people, and the recording I'll send on to people along with the CPD search. But if anybody has stuff on other stuff that I mentioned, I didn't get into that just drop me an email and I'm happy enough to send it on. 2 hours was tight to get stuff done. Thanks, Caroline. Was very, very tight to get stuff done in. So I'm kind of hoping that everybody got something. If anybody ever wants to do a more expanded one, feel free to just drop me a mail. I'm happy to do a more expanded one with people for anyone that wants to do it, or wants to do if you have a group of people that would like to do it, I'm happy to do it for people again. So thanks very much for your time, like I said. And if anybody wants to ask anything before we go, yeah, thank you, Lenny. It certainly was a great audience. Feel free to do that if you can. But thanks very much, guys. I'm just trying to keep up with the questions and stuff.
Tony.
Yes.
I'll just throw one at you there while you're there.
Who's talking to me?
Misha.
Oh yeah, gotcha. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Just in terms of your feedback and your overall views of where we stand at the moment with the QQI level 4 training, and in particular the content and the capabilities of trainers in delivering conflict resolutions and conflict management within that overall matrix as it stands.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's a huge problem in that, one, with any entry-level program, conflict management's only ever going to end up being one learning outcome of probably 25. So any training provider looking to maximize for profit is going to spend probably 1/25 of the time talking about conflict. You know? And I suppose a lot of it will come from that person's perception of conflict. I think it's going to be very challenging in that you're going to have awarding bodies or TP1 providers who are going to sign up, and they're going to approve all their trainers to do it. But they're going to make an assumption that all the trainers can provide at the same level, which is grossly not true. You know, we all know in the industry here that, you know, certain trainers will not be capable of delivering to that level, and other trainers are all from different backgrounds. We have examples of people in this country from alarm installation backgrounds delivering physical intervention courses that they're delivering from a PowerPoint slide. I'm kind of glad George is not here now, because he'd go off and we'll now all together be listening to him for the night. But I'm not referring to him, by the way, but he'd certainly go off. But it is the case. It's the same in the UK. I had the same argument with a person in the UK last week. I personally don't think that outside of probably 8 to 10 trainers that I know of in the country, and this is no disrespect, some of whom are on this call. There's probably 8 to 10 people in the country who have underpinning knowledge, capacity, and experience, I suppose, to deliver to the level that it should be. The alternative to that is that you're going to get it delivered to a lower standard, and anyone who wants to go and do it as an upskilling is going to have to go and do it as an upskilling, but that's what's going to happen, I think, personally. And I think when the new standard comes in, it's going to be a diluted standard when it comes to conflict management. I really think conflict management shouldn't be a part of the entry-level program. It should be a standalone on its own that you have to do in addition to it, because it is going to get diluted down to 1/25 of an entry-level program. You're going to get very basic skills. I don't know, would you agree with it, Terry? I know we've got a couple of trainers on here, so Sean, I don't know if you would have an opinion on it, but Stephen as well. But I think it's going to be a very, very diluted model if it comes in the way that it's going to come in. Especially if they put in a PI model into it as part of a learning outcome, it's going to get grossly diluted, because the awarding body will not stand over any sort of physical intervention that they know nothing about. No, whoever the awarding body is, whether it ends up in PSA or QQI, they will not stand over it. They don't know enough about PI to stand over, which is why I think it should be a standalone, externally accredited module. That's just my opinion, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Would you agree, Terry, or would you disagree? Or
yeah, no, I fully agree. I think it's not only physical intervention or conflict management. You've got first aid thrown in there, manual handling, and you're asking individuals to deliver on these, and they're not suitably qualified. So whether it's their fault, the industry's fault, as a whole, the QQI level 4 is entry level, but it does need a bit of remodeling.
Yeah. I think the whole system, it's a separate conversation for a separate program, I suppose. I think the whole system needs a remodel in terms of, I think it should get away from entry level and you're done, and much more towards a tiered approach to practitioner level, getting somebody to an advanced level, but not being able to come in and do a full program to be an advanced practitioner. Similar to medical, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong here, that you can't actually move on to the next level until you get life experience in one level, actual practical work experience,
Yeah, well, the new theory now is top down. In other words, they're looking for EMTs to train EFRs, EFRs to train FARs, rather than have that kind. I'm going to just say something straight here. I have people in the industry there that are coming out of corporate world, decided to do a first aid instructor's course with never even seen a scratch or a bleed in their life,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what are they teaching? They're just teaching. There's a big difference between common sense, book sense. You know what I mean? Street smart and book smart.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, and the security industry is the same. People from all sorts of backgrounds and stuff like that, as you know. And it's just because somebody's teaching in the industry doesn't mean they've actually ever worked operationally in the industry. But yeah, I think you have a valid point there. I think it's going to get very much diluted unless we change approach to it altogether. The problem with a one-off qualification is once they're qualified, you're qualified. Yeah, I know. And there's nothing then after that.
There's no CPD, no.
Nothing, no. And even if you were doing CPD, it wouldn't take you up a tier, if you know what I mean. So you get the same rate regardless of whether you've done 20 courses or one course. It's a struggle.
Yeah.
To encourage without having a tiered rate, I suppose.
Well, I think, Tony, was there not talk before of a second license? I know from talking to the PSA last year before COVID, there was talk of a supervisor license. Whether that's been put in the back burner now or not, I don't know.
I would think so, in lieu of, I suppose, a couple of things. If you bring in a second license with a higher level qualification, that has to attract a higher level rate of pay, and there's going to be huge pressure on companies to increase wage, which they can't do. And then who is going to dictate at what point you need a supervisor on a site? Is the client going to pay additional if you have 3 people, 5 people, 10 people? Where are you going to dictate? Because what you'll end up doing if you have to pay a supervisor a higher rate is that you'll have companies who just won't have supervisors. But I think it'll be back burner.
But I think it can be a lot more transparent. Where at the moment, I'm asked for supervisors on site, and as it stands at the moment, clients are taking you at face value. But if you have somebody that has a standard issue and it's CPD requirement on a yearly basis, and they're paying for it, it's transparent that the license stipulates it's a supervisor license, so they get what they pay for. Yeah. As it stands at the moment, supervisors are on site whether they're suitably qualified or not is questionable. But I think with a licensing structure, and again on a 12-month cycle, there is a bit more transparency there. Whether it works or not, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you have a valid point in that. Yeah, it would have to be some kind of a distinction from the actual license, I would think. And some kind of reward system that would provide an impetus for somebody to go for it.
Yeah, definitely.
I suppose traditionally what I would see around the place is somebody is a supervisor simply because they're the longest serving member of staff on site.
Yeah.
That doesn't often make them the best person for a supervisor. Similarly to the door industry, I suppose the head doorman is after the head doorman leaves, the next person who's there the longest automatically becomes the head doorman. It doesn't necessarily mean they're a head doorman,
But even for guys coming into the industry, if guys there are 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and a lot of them are on the same rate as guys that start tomorrow, that's not right. It's not fair. And, so if there is a tiered system where somebody straight away advances to a next level, whether it's €1 or 150 or 2, whatever it is, there has to be some kind of engagement with employees to give them the opportunity to step up to the next level. Yeah,
I absolutely think you're right. Like at the moment for those guys, they're getting out of the industry after 10 or 15 years because there's nowhere to progress to.
No.
Where do you go? A lot of the senior management roles have been filled from a business strategic point of view with salespeople. So even to go up operationally, you're going to operations supervisor and then no higher. To go to management level, they're nearly bringing in people at a business level with sales backgrounds and things like that. So a lot of good guys. I suppose the industry's bleeding, and then I suppose they're seeing people being taken in directly who are coming out of military and police and so, and nothing wrong with that. Don't get me wrong, nothing wrong with that. Coming directly in at management level, whereas they're still at the same level after 10 or 15 years. And you'd have to say, well, there's fault on both sides there. In terms of the individual who's doing nothing to show themselves out for 10 or 15 years, and also obviously the organization who will bring somebody in at that level as well. I think
Yeah, but I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of experience versus academia. Some businesses are looking at educational backgrounds before they look specifically at experience. For someone to have 10, 15, 20 years of experience, maybe it warrants the opportunity as much as the academia.
Yeah, I definitely think so, yeah. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. So, guys, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Cheers. Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Thanks very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.
Bye, lads.
Bye.
Bye, lads.
Thanks, Tony. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Tony. Bye.
It was very good.